entire VideoTours library is available for purchase by corporations, educators, and individuals.
Boston wakes up with a bang aboard USS Constitution, the oldest commissioned warship still afloat. Across town, commuters rush out of the Park Street subway station. And nearby, at a bright red line on the sidewalk, visitors take their first steps on an exciting and original self-guided walking tour, the Freedom Trail, a leisurely stroll through more than 350 years of American history. In point of fact, the Freedom Trail has an interesting history of its own. It was during the 1950s that Bill Schofield, then foreign news editor of the Boston Herald-Traveler, proposed a novel idea to link 16 of the most significant historic sites in Boston as a way to help visitors find their way from landmark to landmark and share in the rich history of the city. Then, in the 1960s, Richard Berenson, a Boston businessman, suggested placing a solid red brick line along Schofield's footpath as a way to link each stop along the Freedom Trail in unmistakably clear fashion. Since the mid-1970s, a partnership of the Freedom Trail Foundation, nonprofit organizations, the state of Massachusetts, the city of Boston, the United States Navy, and the National Park Service through the Boston National Historical Park have all collaborated to make the Freedom Trail a unique historical experience. Today, the Red Freedom Trail Guideline allows visitors to follow the footsteps of the Puritans and Patriots without missing one waypoint or wandering astray. The Freedom Trail puts it all together, one step at a time. Unencumbered by formal planning or landscape design, the Boston Common has developed its own distinctive personality over more than 3.5 centuries, playing many roles in the lives of Boston's people. Grazing land for their cattle, playing field for the British game of cricket, military campground. The Common has welcomed everything from hot air balloons to musicians. While Boston Common is not a formal landscape, it has become a favorite park with cherished features. The Frog Pond, the Parkman Bandstand, Lafayette Mall, and the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial, the point where the Freedom Trail meets the Black Heritage Trail, a companion walking tour that originates nearby in Smith Court at the restored African Meeting House and Museum. The memorial is dedicated to the 1st Black Regiment in the Civil War, the 54th Massachusetts. The Common is a perfect place to begin the Freedom Trail, the spot where, for more than 350 years, the people of Boston have exercised their freedom to meet and stroll, to play, meditate, and demonstrate. From the Boston Common, the familiar red line crosses Beacon Street on its way to the State House. You are now standing on a hill above the Common, where the Puritans established their warning beacon. Today, only the name remains. The seat of Massachusetts state government is known as Beacon Hill. Looking at sunlight reflected from the golden dome of the State House, a visitor understands the enthusiasm of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, "The Boston State House is the hub of the solar system." The Massachusetts legislature, known as the Great and General Court, meets in the State House. Under the right of free petition, every Bay State citizen has the opportunity to propose legislation, a far cry from colonial rule. High above the House floor hangs the sacred cod, a 200-year-old carved wooden codfish. Its purpose? To serve as a memorial of the importance of the cod fishery to the welfare of the Commonwealth. In addition to the cod, the State House has acquired a rare and beautiful collection of art objects to complement its interior design. Before the Revolution, the Massachusetts Assembly had to share the old State House with the British governor and his royally appointed officials. The new State House, designed by Boston native Charles Bulfinch, built in 1795 on land once owned by patriot John Hancock, stands today as Boston's architectural declaration of independence. Less than a city block from the State House, the intersection of Park and Tremont Streets has been called Brimstone Corner. How it got started, no one knows, but everyone has a pet theory. One credits the brimstone used for gunpowder stored in an underground crypt of the Park Street Church during the War of 1812. Another touches on the fire and brimstone that issued from zealous congregational preachers. Boston was founded in 1630 as a Puritan community. Brimstone Corner was originally part of their South Burying Ground. Later, it held the town granary, and the name changed to Granary Burying Ground. Here, some of the most famous names in history are presided over by Benjamin Franklin's tribute to his parents. Signers of the Declaration of Independence, including Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The headstone of a legendary American, Paul Revere, is here. In the Granary Burying Ground, a visitor finds the humble and the great together. When the victims of the Boston Massacre were buried here, 3,000 angry citizens came to honor them. And just beyond the Hancock Monument, a simple marker that speaks volumes about human relationships in America of the 18th century. It is a plain stone remembering Frank, servant to John Hancock, Esquire. Each year, millions of people who walk the Freedom Trail spend a quiet moment in this 2 acres of history set among the towering buildings of a busy modern city. The granary was not, however, the first burying ground. That honor was given to Isaac Johnson's vegetable garden, where he was buried in 1630, the year Boston was founded as a Puritan community. Isaac's grave has been lost to the ages, but the remaining markers in King's Chapel Burying Ground make interesting reading. Joseph Tapping's is one of the foremost examples of early stone carving art. 19th century author Nathaniel Hawthorne took frequent walks through King's Chapel Burying Ground. Legend has it that the headstone of Elizabeth Payne may have served as the suggestion of the letter A for Hawthorne's famous novel, The Scarlet Letter. Also buried here is John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts, and William Dawes, who rode with Paul Revere to alarm the countryside that the British were coming, and Mary Chilton, the first Pilgrim woman to land at Plymouth. In 1688, with arrogance born of divine right, James II literally threw the Puritans off a section of their burying ground to make room for the Anglican Church. Today, it is hard to imagine the galling effect this had on the Puritans. They, who had left their native England to escape religious persecution, were thrown off their land and forced to make way for an elaborate form of worship they considered heretical. Outrage smoldered for more than 60 years. Then, in 1749, the angry citizens exploded. When Boston's elite Anglicans laid the cornerstone for the present building, angry citizens interrupted the ceremonies by throwing garbage and dead animals into the crowd. In 1785, led by a new pastor from Salem, Massachusetts, it became the first Unitarian church in America. Today, the parish still follows a combination of Unitarian theology and Anglican liturgy. Modern audiences enjoy regular organ recitals performed on a replica of the 1756 instrument. Each Sunday, a voice from the past calls the King's Chapel congregation to worship. It is a bell cast by Paul Revere in 1816. He called it the sweetest bell we ever made. Time has done what only time can do. It has melted the heat of the Puritans' passion and cast a new role for King's Chapel. Around the corner from King's Chapel is a sidewalk mosaic celebrating both the site of Boston Latin School and the Puritan dedication to public education. Nearby, a statue of a Boston Latin student who would later put his public education to spectacular use, Benjamin Franklin. Passing the highly ornamented Second Empire Old City Hall, the Freedom Trail moves down School Street to Washington, to a place where the very sidewalk seems to give off literary thought. The Old Corner Bookstore was a literary hub of America's 19th century intellectual awakening. It attracted such earthshakers as Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Louisa May Alcott, and Charles Dickens. Today, the Old Corner Bookstore is still serving the literary tastes of Bostonians more than 150 years after its heyday. The next 4 stops on the Freedom Trail represent a transition from Boston's Puritan heritage to the period of public unrest and anger that led to the War for Independence. There is perhaps no more appropriate place to gain a new appreciation of free speech than the Old South Meeting House. In this fascinating museum, modern visitors feel the living presence of ideas that gave energy and drive to American independence. The Puritan spirit is very much in evidence, aided by modern audiovisual techniques and display cases containing things that actually belong to the founding Puritans. Talking walls guide the visitor through the building's history. A series of optical aids direct attention to important meeting house features. It is not too long before you are swept back to events in December 1773 that led to the now famous Boston Tea Party. A public gathering to discuss ways to halt the offloading of tea convened in Boston's largest meeting hall, Old South. It is all here to be relived in 18th century ambience. It was a pivotal test of will between the Crown and the colonies. Samuel Adams, the Sons of Liberty, and the citizens of Boston were determined that the tea aboard the newly arrived vessel Dartmouth must never be unloaded. When the meeting learned that Governor Hutchinson had refused to allow the ship to leave, Samuel Adams shouted the words that ignited the Boston Tea Party. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." And the rest, as they say, is history. History that comes to life every day in the Old South Meeting House. Old South shows a stubborn instinct for survival. During the occupation of Boston, the British gutted the church, using it for a stable and riding academy. They tore up the Bibles for kindling and burned the pews to keep their horses warm. After the Revolution, Old South was restored, only to be threatened again in less than 100 years. Out of control, a citywide fire raged toward Old South. Only the last-minute arrival of a pumper from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, saved it from total destruction. But Old South's troubles were far from over. In the latter part of the 19th century, the building was auctioned off to be torn down for salvage. Again, there was an 11th-hour rescue, this time by the oratory of well-known abolitionist Wendell Phillips, Julia Ward Howe, and others. Their combined effort aroused public support and saved Old South. It also marked a turning point. The restoration of Old South signaled the beginning of historic preservation in New England. Today, Old South, the lively museum, continues to be a meeting house for spirited debate, an activity that is no stranger to these walls or the Puritans who built them. After nearly 280 years, the Old State House is one of the oldest public buildings still standing in the United States. In its day, 2 often diametrically opposed bodies met here: the governor and other royal appointees in the council chamber, and next door, the freely elected Massachusetts Assembly, often in outspoken protest of England's authority. In 1761, the walls of the State House reverberated with especially dramatic oratory. James Otis resigned as the King's Advocate General with a 4-hour protest speech against the writs of assistance for the King's customs collectors. Later, John Adams would say that his rhetoric led to the birth of American independence. A visitors' gallery installed in 1766 marked the first time in America that ordinary citizens were able to see their government in action. Inside the Old State House, a fascinating museum introduces visitors to early Boston through its art and artifacts, including a vial of tea from the Boston Tea Party. Bostonians first heard the Declaration of Independence read from the old State House balcony, whereupon the jubilant crowd tore the lion and unicorn, royal symbols of authority, from the building and burned them. Perhaps on the spot where 6 years before, in 1770, British soldiers had shot and killed 5 Americans out of an angry mob of several hundred. Today, a circle of stones marks what became known as the Boston Massacre. 2 contrasting facts about the massacre highlight the character of pre-revolutionary America. On the one hand, Paul Revere used highly exaggerated engravings of the confrontation to inflame the public. And on the other, 2 famous advocates of independence, John Adams and his colleague Josiah Quincy, ably defended the British soldiers involved, winning acquittal for all but 2. After the Revolution in 1798, the legislature moved to the new State House on Beacon Hill. The deserted building served a hodgepodge of purposes, from wig dealers to wine merchants. The old State House became a city hall in 1830, and by the late 19th century, it was considered an eyesore, about to be torn down. Only when the people of Chicago offered to buy it did a private group of citizens organize the Bostonian Society, which saved and restored this national treasure. The old State House stands today as a constant reminder of the American belief that representative government should be open to the people it serves. There was no way Peter Faneuil could have known he was building a cradle of liberty. Instead, Peter had proposed a market to encourage and accommodate the country people who bring provisions into this town. It was not a popular idea. In fact, his offer was accepted by such a slim margin that Peter decided at the last minute to appease his critics by adding a meeting hall on the 2nd floor above the market stalls. Faneuil Hall was early Boston's town hall, in which her citizens practiced the same kind of democracy found in town halls all over New England. Meetings here were seldom dull. Early debates included fiery protests of the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, and British troop landings climaxed by the first of the Tea Party gatherings. In 1806, Charles Bulfinch enlarged the building. Since then, Faneuil Hall has served as a public forum for virtually every major American issue. It hosted both abolitionists and a defense of slavery by Jefferson Davis. It has heard debate on women's rights, temperance, and every American war from 1812 to the present. It has seen a potpourri of events, from political rallies and tax revolts to orchestra concerts and spelling bees. Faneuil Hall is also the home of another Boston institution, the oldest military unit in North America, the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company. Atop his combination marketplace meeting hall, Peter Faneuil left a curious symbol, a copper and gold leaf grasshopper. Theories abound, ranging from the preference of farmers who use the market to the existence of a similar grasshopper on the Royal Exchange in London that Peter may have wanted to emulate. But whatever the reason, the Faneuil Hall grasshopper swings in silence, keeping his secret for all time. As it makes its way from Faneuil Hall to the North End, the Freedom Trail passes through a rich blend of old and new Boston. Quincy Market, the new City Hall, a double statue of James Michael Curley, Boston's colorful mayor who served 4 terms from 1914 to 1949, a matrix of ancient alleys and byways. Threading under the central artery, the Freedom Trail emerges in the North End. Originally separated from the center of town by a creek, the North End today is a colorful Italian neighborhood where brilliant ethnic symbols contrast with strong ties to the colonial past. From 1770 to 1800, a small wooden house on North Square was home to a man who became an American legend. But a traveler on the Freedom Trail soon discovers that this building has a life of its own, a life that reflects the history of the North End, both before and after the Revere family. It was considered a large, fashionable structure when it was built about 1680. Boston was only 50 years old, and Paul Revere's grandfather was a small boy in France. Wealthy merchants and tradesmen occupied the North End. When Paul Revere bought the house 90 years later, it was already somewhat of an antique. In the early 19th century, staggering drunken sailors filled the streets. Middle-class residents began to leave the North End. They were quickly replaced by boarding houses, dance halls, taverns, and brothels. During the mid-19th century, a flood of immigrants settled in the North End. By the 1890s, 23,000 people packed the small peninsula. The North End gradually became a slum. At the turn of the century, Paul Revere's former home was a tenement with a cigar factory and a bank on the first floor. And then, like so many historic landmarks, it was almost lost. But in 1905, the house was rescued and, over the next few years, restored by the Paul Revere Memorial Association. A self-guided tour of the Paul Revere House is a step across the threshold of time. Visitors pass through at their own pace, stopping where they choose to read descriptive displays and to gain a deeper understanding of a great American. Though it made him an American folk hero, Paul Revere was far more than a dispatch rider alerting the countryside to a British preemptive strike. He was a craftsman, an artist who learned to express himself in precious metals and engravings. He was active in the Masonic Order, deeply involved in Boston politics, and committed to community service. After the Revolution, Revere took on another career. He became a merchant, importing goods from England and running a small hardware store. However, his association with metalwork prevailed. In 1788, he opened a foundry which produced cannons, bells, and spikes. Paul Revere made many of the brass fittings on the ship USS Constitution. He started the first successful copper rolling mill in the United States. Paul Revere died in 1818 at the age of 83. He lived a full and varied life, a life all too often compressed into the events of a single night, April 18th, 1775. Contrary to popular legend, Paul Revere did not place the signal lanterns in Old North Church, nor were they a signal to him. He had arranged the code with friends in Charlestown because they were afraid he wouldn't be able to get out of town. The lanterns were hung by the church sexton, 23-year-old Robert Newman, at great personal risk. After a secret meeting with Revere, Newman climbed the 190-foot steeple, showing the lanterns at the window quickly to avoid detection by the British. 2 months later, in an ironic turn of history, General Gage would watch the Battle of Bunker Hill from the same window. Like Paul Revere, Old North Church has more to its identity than one fateful night. Completed in 1723, the proper name is Christ Church in Boston. While those who met here belonged to the Church of England, they were also merchants who felt the pressure of imposed taxes. This led them to hold a more tolerant view of independence than their uptown brethren in King's Chapel. Today, Old North has an active, involved congregation. They sit in tall box pews, like those purchased by their early American predecessors, surrounded by reminders of their church's historic legacy. The window Robert Newman climbed out after showing his lanterns, accidentally rediscovered in 1989 when a workman's hammer slipped, breaking through the brick wall that had covered it for decades. A bust of George Washington that Lafayette declared to be more like him than any other portrait. A memorial plaque presented in 1875 by the British naval and military veterans of Massachusetts. A touching tribute to Major John Pitcairn, a British Marine who fell at Bunker Hill and is buried beneath the church. And the third lantern, lit by President Gerald Ford during the American Bicentennial in 1976. A new signal to call the nation to renewed effort and hope in its third century. Copp's Hill Burying Ground is named for the 17th century shoemaker William Copp, who originally owned it. The land became a burial ground in 1659. It was the high ground occupied by a British encampment during the Revolution. British soldiers often took potshots at the headstone of Captain Daniel Malcolm, a member of the Sons of Liberty, who left an inscription admonishing survivors to bury him in a stone grave 10 feet deep, where he would be safe from British bullets. Visitors on the Freedom Trail can still see the scars of their musket balls. Other noteworthy graves are those of Prince Hall, who founded the African Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, known today as the Prince Hall Masonic Order. The tomb of those fiery Puritan preacher-politicians, Increase and Cotton Mather, and Robert Newman, the Old North Church sexton. Copp's Hill commands a majestic view of USS Constitution and Bunker Hill Monument across the Charles River. Batteries here opened fire on Charlestown during the Battle of Bunker Hill. As it crosses over the Charles River, the Freedom Trail opens up a choice. You can continue toward USS Constitution or to the Bunker Hill Monument. The Battle of Bunker Hill was actually fought on the adjoining Breeds Hill, where the monument and museum stand. This historical anomaly is the result of a last-minute decision by American Colonel William Prescott. Inside the museum, visitors can relive the battle through exciting dioramas. For the fledgling American army of several thousand men facing over 2,000 sleek British regulars and Marines, Bunker Hill was a battle for survival, 18th century warfare at its most vicious. Over and over in the summer heat, rows of fully equipped redcoats marched shoulder to shoulder directly into a wall of hot lead from the Americans. Bayonet charges, brutal hand-to-hand combat. Before they finally retreated, the Americans lost 400 to 500, but the battle cost the British 1,054 casualties, almost 1 out of every 2 regulars who took the field. General Howe had completely miscalculated the character of the men he faced. He vowed never to launch a frontal attack on an American force again. Today, hardy visitors can climb the 294 steps and gain a spectacular view of the harbor, the city, and a good portion of surrounding New England landscape. The Freedom Trail ends with a visit to a famous lady, probably the most celebrated ship in American history, USS Constitution, berthed at the Charlestown Navy Yard. She was the 3rd warship in the young nation's Navy. Launched in 1797, USS Constitution was tough from the beginning, tougher even than her builders imagined. Built of thick live oak timbers from the Sea Islands of Georgia, she surprised friend and foe alike when cannonballs bounced off her hull during the War of 1812. As a result, the sailors nicknamed her Old Ironsides. The Constitution resides at the Charlestown Navy Yard. Thousands of skilled craftsmen and women built American fighting ships here from the age of sail to the Vietnam War. Today, the Navy Yard is preserved by the National Park Service as part of the Boston National Historical Park. In respect for her service, USS Constitution remains on active duty, carefully preserved as a proud member of the United States Navy Fleet. Nothing gives meaning to a tour of the Constitution like a visit to the Constitution Museum. It is filled not only with the sights, sounds, and artifacts, but the feelings, the emotional impact of shipboard life as America, the youngest nation, took her place on the 7 seas. Imagine the closeness of living, sleeping, and eating in cramped quarters. Become the captain of the Constitution. Play the computer game. Make decisions and learn the consequences. Watch ship model builders in action and learn how school children use their pennies to help save the Constitution during the Great Depression. The museum adds another dimension, a special depth to the Constitution experience. Perhaps the most exciting aspect of the Freedom Trail is that no two walking tours are ever the same. The whole texture of early American life is laid out along this red line. The Puritans and their escape from persecution, the road to independence, and the emergence of a new nation. The Freedom Trail is more than so many inches, feet, or miles. You measure it in events, waypoints in American history.
The entire VideoTours library is available for purchase by corporations, educators, and individuals.